This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 28th of March, 2023. Welcome back to the podcast. We're a little late getting started today. Indeed, we're 11 minutes late. I'm really sorry about that because I've actually been presenting the podcast for the past 10 minutes. We went live, or we didn't go live. I started talking at exactly 5 o'clock. What I didn't do is hit the go live button on my YouTube page. So basically, I've been podcasting to myself for the last 10 minutes. However, we have recouped and we have now gotten the go live button clicked, and I am back on live, and presumably you can now see or hear me. So no difficulties, nothing major happened. I just literally didn't click the go live button. You'll notice that it's just me today. It's not Michael. Michael is embarked on a Memorial Day recreational outing, so he is not going to be there. So, well, I'm afraid you're just going to have to be happy with having me talk to you today, but that's okay, because I have something today that I do want to talk to you about, something that I think is relatively important. We're going through a really weird time in our society. We're hearing things that 20 years ago would have been unthinkable, but now normal people are jumping into support. We're now seeing stores who have transgender clothing for children. That just would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. What is going on? Why is everything in our society seemingly so higgledy-piggledy at the moment? Well, I think I have an explanation. And that explanation is something that I want to present to you tonight. So, I want to talk to you about something that I'm calling the transition of ages. Why are we going through all of this turmoil right now in our society? And I think I have an answer for that. Now, as I just indicated, things are not looking great for our society at the moment. In fact, things look pretty bad. There's a lot of stuff going on that, for many of us, makes us wonder if the world is just going crazy. I mean, clearly the world is not and has not been a nice place. I mean, we just had a government that basically, in terms of COVID, implemented government policies that many people would consider to be completely antithetical to what our Constitution empowers our government to do. And of course, it's not just our government, but governments all over the world were doing this. So the world is becoming progressively a less nice place. People, as I talked about briefly earlier, are believing weird things. The whole transgender movement. Indeed, in the past year or so, we've seen a rise in the defense of what we're calling minor attracted persons, apparently, but what we would have 10 years ago simply called pedophiles or kid touchers. Now we're supposed to have some sort of sympathy for these people. This is a weird idea, and one that would have been completely socially unacceptable, I mean, just recently. And yet, here we are. We're seeing assaults on rights from the government. We can talk about the censorship that's going on, where big tech is just, hiding things like the Hunter Biden lapbook story. Well, we'll just throw that out. Government now talking about having to regulate hate speech and disinformation and telling us that, well, the First Amendment doesn't actually protect those things, even though for 200 and some years, we've been pretty sure that it in fact did protect exactly that. But this push towards censorship, the push against the Second Amendment, that we don't really have Second Amendment rights, or to the extent that such a right exists, it's a right, a collective right, a right for the states. An idea, by the way, that did not exist prior to the 20th century, but nevertheless, that's what we're being told. And increasingly, the civilian ownership of firearms is under assault by the government. Our two-tiered justice system. Andrew McCabe, the director of the FBI, or at least at the time the acting director of the FBI, lied to federal investigators from the Department of Justice IG team and basically just told them lies about his actions during the Trump-Russia collusion investigation. They found out these lies were told, that he had told them untrue things under oath of perjury. Did he go to jail? No. I mean, he was forced to resign, but they even gave him his pension. So he was only 2 weeks away from retiring anyway, so no harm, no foul. He just didn't have to go into the office for 2 weeks. That was his penalty. Of course, if you or I lie to the FBI on just about anything, that becomes a process crime that will get us sent to federal prison for at least 6 months. After all, it happened to Martha Stewart. There is a class of people in this country for whom breaking the law does not seem to have any consequence. But for normal people, well, the rules are for the normal people, the little people. The rules aren't for the government or media elites in our society. For example, a couple of years ago, Chuck Todd, the NBC reporter, was in Washington, D.C., broadcasting from Washington, D.C., and during a broadcast, he held up a 30-round AR-15 magazine, a real one, on his broadcast. His possession of a 30-round AR-15 magazine was, at the time, a felony in the District of Columbia. Nobody ever prosecuted him. He didn't spend a day in jail. He got away with it because, well, he had the right point, or the politically correct point, in possessing that felonious 30-round magazine in the District of Columbia, so nobody ever did anything to him. Although any normal person whom the D.C. Metro Police would have come across with a 30-round magazine, even with no bullets, no rifle, just possession of the magazine, would have been charged with a gun crime in Washington, D.C. So there's something terribly awry with our justice system. And some of the ideas that we're hearing are ideas that can't possibly be juxtaposed with each other. They can't be true. We are told by some people that the police are racist. Indeed, they're systemically racist, that they are one of the primary methods of enforcing the systemic racism of our society on black people. These same people also tell us that the only people who should have guns are the police. In effect, we're being told the police are racist and only racists should have guns. That is not an intellectually reconcilable set of positions. And yet there are plenty of people who believe both of these things simultaneously, and indeed will even tell us these things in the same paragraph. There's just a lot of weirdness going on. What is happening? Where is all of this weirdness coming from? We have to have some explanation for why this is happening, for why people have these weird ideas and why these things are being pushed in public and why there is this push for now censorship and disinformation and other pushes to take away our fundamental rights under the Constitution, or if you live outside the United States, the fundamental human rights that have been recognized by international law. Why is our politics so polarized? And the type of polarization that we have. You go back to the 1980s. There was still polarized politics, but largely that polarization was about policy. For example, the Democrats wanted a system of taxation and spending that would be much closer to what we normally see in Europe. Relatively high rates of marginal taxation, coupled with relatively high rates of social spending. The Republicans didn't want that. They wanted lower taxes, and the idea was that increases in economic growth would increase wealth and prosperity all across the economic spectrum, making these heavy taxation and social expenditures unnecessary over time. Now, those are policy agreements that people basically agreed about the same facts, and it was an argument about the benefits and drawbacks of the relative policy mixes that were being talked about. But that's not the type of political polarization we have today. Our political polarization is largely cultural. And it's gotten to the point where the two sides of any given political argument not only present different policy ideas, but different facts that support those policy ideas. Our political polarization is one where we can't even agree on fundamental facts about the policies. That is a huge change from the policy disagreements of the 1980s or 1990s. The assaults on civil rights that we've talked about previously. And this weird historical revisionism that we see popping up. For example, in Great Britain, there is a movement, just as there is in the United States, for reparations for slavery. And there is literally no acknowledgement, certainly on the British side, and this is where I think it's mostly important in the context of this idea, that yes, the British were a slave trading nation at one point. Then the British banned slavery. Then the British sent the Royal Navy to West Africa to hunt down and sink anyone who was engaged in the African slave trade. In other words, the British Empire single-handedly extirpated the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, one would think that this would be a part of the discussion, that it would at least inform our ideas about Britain's attitude towards slavery in the 1800s, vice their attitude towards slavery in the 16 or 1700s, and yet it does not. All we really care about is that because Britain touched the historical sin of slave trading, nothing that they did subsequently to that, no policy change that they made is important. They are stained with the guilt of the original sin of having engaged in slave trading. Well, I have an idea as to what's going on and why all of this stuff is happening. But to explain that idea, I've got to tell you a little bit of a story. We have to go back, well, more than a few years to tell this story, so it's going to be a bit of a long story. I'm going to ask for your patience as I go through this story and I bring us up to the modern day with what I think is an explanation of why our societies seem to have gone off the rails, not just here in the United States, but globally. So let's start telling the story. Our story begins, well, a relatively long time ago. In 330 AD, when the Roman Emperor Constantine declared that Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. Prior to this date, the Roman Empire had been traditionally a pagan society. Now, there was a new state religion, and it was Christianity. It replaced the old state religions with the Roman pantheon. As a result of this, the Catholic Church began to rise in power in Western Europe, hastened, of course, by the fall of the Roman Empire itself. The Roman Empire fell, but the church remained, and the church began to become increasingly powerful. One of the controls that the church had on society, because, by the 14th or 15th century, the church's control over society was pretty much absolute, was that the church controlled all production of knowledge. There were no printed books. There were no printers at the time. All books had to be transcribed by hand. And for the most part, they were transcribed by hand by monks working in monasteries under the direct authority of the Catholic Church, or occasionally at a few of the universities that existed in Europe, which were, again, under at least the indirect control of the Catholic Church. So the Roman Catholic Church had a monopoly on the production and dissemination of knowledge. And of course, to create a book, well, it took weeks and weeks because the book had to be transcribed by hand. And so the amount of information that could be produced and the cost of obtaining that information was so high that very, very few people had access to real knowledge. It was controlled basically via a monopoly that was held by the Roman Catholic Church. Because of the fall of the Roman Empire and the split of the Roman Empire into many different nations, so you end up with ultimately Austria-Hungary, France, Great Britain, Italy, Spain. Well, Italy came way later. Italy wasn't actually unified until 1865, but still, you had all of these different nationalities that began to arise in Europe, each with their own political systems, and yet all of them part of the Roman Catholic community, what was called at the time Christendom. And the church, even though they never came right out and said it, had supreme political power in Europe as well. Because all a pope had to do was declare the king of whoever to be excommunicated from the Catholic Church, which meant they were no longer the anointed king of that country. They no longer had God's favor. They were, in fact, a heretic, and they could be easily removed. Now, this was kind of the political atomic bomb of the medieval era, and the church would never use it indiscriminately and would not use it at all if they could avoid doing so. But that tool was there. It was in their toolbox, and everyone knew that the Pope could, if necessary, remove them from power. Well, of course, this level of power, being the supreme cultural and political institution in Western Europe, as it was, really fostered corruption. You know, it's pretty much a universal human attribute that if you have unquestioned authority, as Lord Acton said, if you have absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. And the church became extremely corrupt. And if you wanted to go back and read about the Medici popes, for example, in the 12th and 13th, or the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries, there's a lot of bad stories. But of course, it's what we expect. The Roman Catholic Church is a human institution. It was run by humans. Humans are deeply flawed, and all humans are prone to the temptations of absolute power, and the people who ran the church were no different. And so the church became, during the age of the church, extraordinarily corrupt. And of course, by the end of it, there was the selling of indulgences. Oh, you've sinned? Well, hey, if you pay us enough money, we'll just write you a document that says you'll go straight to heaven. And of course, in a time when the afterlife was of very, very great importance to the average person, those indulgences were worth a lot of money. And of course, they went straight into the pockets of the church. Indeed, in many cases, church-owned properties were actually properties that were in the name of the bishop of the area individually. It wasn't corporately owned by the church. It was literally owned by the bishop, which meant that the bishop could, if he wanted, grant lands to his own heirs or assigns. Oh, and yes, by the way, many high-level churchmen had heirs. In fact, there were several popes that had one or more children, despite their vows of chastity. And, of course, owning all of the church's land as a bishop seems to be a violation of your vows of poverty as well. Nevertheless, it was a very corrupt institution. Understandably so, because any institution with absolute power tends to become absolutely corrupt. Now, I would note that this was not a global phenomenon. This was largely restricted to Western Europe. I mean, obviously, there were things going on in China and Africa and Eastern Europe, Russia, that had nothing to do with all of this. So that's understandable, because the world at that time was largely a regional world. And in fact, barely a regional world even at that. Distances were long. Communications took a long time to get from one side of Europe to the other, even though compared to, say, the United States, Europe has a fairly small mass of land. So this was a regional age. So this analogy doesn't extend to the entire world, but it does extend to Western Europe, which, from my point of view, of course, is the source of American civilization. Our parent civilization is European Christendom, even though one might not notice it from the current state of our civilization. But this was Western Europe, And it was about to suffer a moment of change. Because in the year 1450, a man named Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press using movable type. Now, he didn't invent everything that makes up modern printing. There were some precursor technologies that had to exist before movable type could be a viable technology that could be used to print books. So obviously you needed to know how to produce paper in large quantities, how to bind books in relatively large quantities, how to cast metal and do precision metal casting that would allow you to cast these tiny little letters that you would use to mount on the printing plate to impress ink onto a page. So those precursor technologies had existed for a while. It was Johannes Gutenberg that brought them all together into the idea of a printing press. And as a result, Johannes Gutenberg is the man who destroyed the Roman Catholic Church and indeed the societal age in which he had been born. He didn't mean to. It wasn't his intention. Indeed, his intention was exactly the opposite of that. The first book that Johannes Gutenberg printed was a Bible. And Gutenberg thought that, you know what? I'm looking back over here, and I've been going through this presentation, and from what I can see on my camera, it is not showing you the right thing. Well, that's not the right thing either. You should be seeing Johannes Gutenberg, and you're not. So I am having all kinds of problems with my presentation today, and we are not seeing what I want to see. So we see the PowerPoint one, but I am not seeing the actual slide. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to escape out of that, and we're going to hit cancel there, and I am going to refresh my PowerPoint phrase or my PowerPoint presentation, and there we go. Now you're seeing what you should have seen. So I'm sorry, there was this huge wall of text I've been talking about, and you haven't been able to see any of it. So I apologize. It's not even showing you the text as it's coming up on the screen. I'm not sure why that is happening. I'm not sure why my camera isn't working out the way that it is supposed to. So you know what we're going to have to do? We are going to have to just change this window, and we'll have to forget about running the PowerPoint presentation as a full screen presentation. We're going to have to change the window that we're looking at. We're just going to go back and look at the PowerPoint. I think with that, at least we can see it. Don't know why OBS is messing all of this up. So unfortunately, we're going to go back over here to view, and we're going to go back to that slide because that's the slide we're looking at. And we are just going to go back to a normal view. And indeed, we are going to get rid of that. And we are going to get rid of this bottom frame here. And we are just going to look at my presentation here. So I'm very sorry that we've missed all the initial part of the presentation. I wasn't even looking over at my monitor to see what it was that we were looking at. So we've missed all of that. I apologize. It's just been me talking. Hasn't really changed what I've said, but you haven't been able to see what I said. So back to Gutenberg. Gutenberg, as I said, is the man who destroyed the power of the Catholic Church in Europe. He didn't mean to. Like I said, the very first book he printed was a Bible, which was presented to the Pope. And the Pope thought this Bible thing and this printing thing was a great idea. Now, on the face of it, it's a pretty simple invention. Hey, we don't have to write books down anymore. All we have to do is just print these bad boys out. And once we print them out, well, we can print them out a lot faster, and we can disseminate them to universities much easier. It just makes our lives a bit easier. So why what caused this simple invention to destroy the age of the church in Europe? Well, there were a couple of things that were going on as a result of this new technology. What printing enabled was a change by an order of magnitude in the democratization of information that was available to people. Because books could be printed much more quickly and much more cheaply, and because once you knew the principles of the movable type press, it was fairly easy to replicate, it spiraled eventually out of control. Remember, the church had a monopoly on the production of and dissemination of information. Any book that you wanted to publish, quite apart from the laborious process that it would take at the time to publish that book, to reproduce it by hand, required the approval of the Catholic Church. It took a while. After all, travel times were long. The dissemination of knowledge at the time was much slower than today. But you could create a printing press and you could begin printing books in basically a single building. And the Catholic Church couldn't control, couldn't search, couldn't find every printing press that might exist in every building across Europe. Even for its time, the technology of the printing press really exploded. It took, of course, several years for it to explode in what we would consider of an explosion of knowledge, which, a month ago we didn't know anything, and now a month later we all know all about it. Now, things happened much slower then, but within the constraints of travel times and the dissemination of information in 1450 to 1500, that information traveled extremely quickly all across Western Europe. And a number of printers started to come up, many of which were not under the direct control of the church. They were just private companies who were running their own printing presses. That led to an increase in what I'm calling heterodox ideas, ideas over which the church had no control. People were saying things that were not approved by the church. And because it was in printed books, and because once you had printed this books, you now had a storage of knowledge that you could replicate 500, 1,000 times and give to 1,000 people, all of these unorthodox ideas could be spread out in European society. And of course, all of that information, like I said, once it existed, it was now permanent. It existed in books. Obviously, you could destroy the books. You could burn them or whatever. And the Catholic Church didn't seem to have much of a problem with that when times called for it. But books could also be easily hidden and easily smuggled, and much of the interdiction of the church could be avoided. And because it was so easy to publish these new, unorthodox ideas, it led to an explosion, as one does. When one comes up with one idea, someone else looks at that idea and improves on it, and it leads them in their line of thinking to even more new ideas that they might want to publish, and that's exactly what happened. There were a whole bunch of new ideas that were disseminated from books, and the books themselves prompted the creation of other new ideas that were then in turn disseminated in books. The age of the church was over, and we entered the age of the book. And the age of the book killed the age of the church permanently. Think of all the things that happened largely because of the existence of the printing press. The German monk, Martin Luther, seeing the corruption of church officials of his day, printed up a copy of something he called the 95 Theses, and he nailed them to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, and thus kicked off the Protestant Reformation. And once Martin Luther had come out with his idea, even though the church tried to squelch it, it was now impossible because those ideas had been printed and reproduced quickly and sent across Europe. And suddenly, it was no longer just Martin Luther. It was Calvin Zwingli in Switzerland who came up with the Calvinist version of Protestantism, the Anabaptists, a whole bunch of other sects that came up. And so there were all of these questioning of the doctrine of the church, and indeed the creation of what were in effect new and breakaway churches, which also led to some other trouble about which we'll discuss in due course. Because of the existence of books, we began to see the codification and the dissemination of science. Indeed, the creation of the entire idea of the scientific method was now available to really anyone who wanted to read them. So you would have someone who is an absolute genius like Sir Isaac Newton, who could write a book like Principia Mathematica, which basically he discovered gravity. He also created calculus in an afternoon because there was a math problem he couldn't solve. And he was a pretty smart guy. And he could put all of his ideas on paper, and these ideas could be disseminated. Now, some of these ideas were not ideas the church wanted to hear about. For example, if we move into the 1500s, the church's idea was, and I know we hear this a lot, the church thought the world was flat. The church did not think the world was flat. The Roman Catholic Church never thought the world was flat. Indeed, the Greek philosopher Eratosthenes in 300 BC had proven that the earth was a sphere with a diameter of 25,000-ish miles. In fact, he was within a couple of percent of the actual circumference of the actual size of the earth. But what the church did believe was that even though the earth was a globe, that the sun and the moon and all of the planets and all of the stars revolved around the earth. And of course, people who could, once telescopes were invented, begin to look in telescopes, could begin to print their books like Galileo and Copernicus about, well, it's not really us in the middle. We're kind of orbiting some other stuff. The moon orbits us, but everything else looks like it's orbiting the sun. These were heretical ideas. And the church, though they tried, and certainly in the case of individuals tried to quash them, they could never quash the ideas. Because once they'd been printed in books, they spread in the 16th and 15th century rate that we would consider by wildfire, even though by our standards it was very slow. But they couldn't stop that dissemination. Ultimately, this led to the publication of new political ideas. The philosophers, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Thomas Paine, talking about a completely different form of government, one that had never been really tried before in Europe, the idea of democratic governance, which led, of course, to the American Revolution, ultimately to the French Revolution. Also, these ideas created an intellectual idea called the Enlightenment, where we get Enlightenment liberalism from, the whole idea of natural rights, rights that inhere in the individual simply because they're an individual, and rights for whom it is invalid or not allowed or shouldn't be allowed for government to infringe upon, because those are our inherent rights given to us in the terms of the day by our Creator. They should be outside government control. The church ultimately lost its political authority. I talked about Italy and 1865 and Italian unification. The church used to own a large part of Italy. They were called the Papal States. The church was not just a religious organization. At least in those areas of Italy, it was also the dominant political organization. The church had its own country, the Papal States. And of course, during Italian unification in 1865, the church was forced to give up everything but Vatican City. The idea that a head of state in Europe could force the church to give all of its lands to that state would have been literally impossible in 1450. The church would have they would have excommunicated whatever head of state tried it. And by 1865, they had no choice but to give it up because the church had lost all political control in Europe. And indeed, even in Northern Europe, in countries like what was called at the time the Germanies, because there was no Germany as a country, there were a variety of states little duchies and dukedoms and things like that made up what we now call Germany, but what at the time was just a collection of small states that they called the Germanies. But in the Germanies, and in Sweden, for example, the Lutheran Church was the dominant church in much of it, and those Lutheran churches became state churches. In Great Britain, Henry VIII broke the Church of England away from the Roman Catholic Church, and Henry VIII declared himself to be the head of the Church of England, just as in Sweden, King Gustavus Adolphus was the head of the Lutheran Church of Sweden. In other words, religious authority was now subordinate to the political authority of whatever country those religious orders existed in. It was a complete shift in what a couple of hundred years before had been the dominant hierarchy, where the church was at the top and the state came below the church. Now, the church is falling under state control. So that was a big change that was brought about by the age of the book. The church was no longer the dominant elite. Someone else was. We'll talk about that in a little bit. All right. Now, all of these things that we've talked about so far would seem like good things, right? Hey, the rise of democracy, the rise of human rights, of natural rights, the elimination of church control over all of it. This all sounds great. Well, kinda, but it also came with some bad stuff as well. If it hadn't been for the printing press, there wouldn't have been a Protestant Reformation. If there hadn't been a Protestant Reformation, there wouldn't have been the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century. Indeed, in 1618, the 30 Years' War started. It was explicitly a religious war between Catholics and largely Lutheran Protestants. It was fought in Germany. More than 8 million people were killed during this 30 Years' War, including at least a third of the civilian population of the Germanies. After the 30 Years' War ended, indeed it took 100 years for Germany's population to reapproach the population that had existed there in 1618. Also, if you're going to question religious orthodoxy and have a Protestant Reformation, ultimately you're questioning, if you continue to your logical conclusion, you're going to start questioning the orthodoxy of religion itself. And by the 19th century, that was what was happening. Because once we have we break this carved in stone idea that the church can't be questioned, and then we move to, well, actually the church can be questioned and the church can be wrong, somebody, ultimately many people, are going to move to the idea that all churches can be questioned and all churches can be wrong. And for 1,000 years, over 1,000 years, the Roman Catholic Church, and then its substitutes, Lutheranism, Calvinism, and other brands of Protestant Reformation Protestantism, they supplied meaning to society, meaning to the culture. When Henry VIII took the Church of England out of the Roman Catholic Church and built his own church, it was not his intention to destroy Christian doctrine. It was just his intention to have control over the church, largely because he wanted the church to grant him divorces whenever he wanted, apparently, since he had 6 wives, and the Church of England would do it for him. But he didn't really want to attack Christian doctrine, and yet that's what the Protestant Reformation led directly to. And if our religion is questioned or questionable, what does that mean about our lives? I mean, something that gave us the fundamental meaning of our life now appears at best flawed, which led to the rise of what we now call nihilism. It was first sort of explained by the philosopher Schopenhauer, whose philosophy can be basically brought down into a single phrase: life sucks, then you die. For Schopenhauer, life was this endless cycle of suffering, which is brought to a merciful end somehow when our lifespan expires. It's not a very optimistic view of human life. It is that our life has no meaning. It has nothing. It's pointless and worthless. It's just endless suffering. Indeed, Schopenhauer concluded, it would be better if none of us had ever been born than to have to be born and then to live this life of constant suffering. Let's say that Schopenhauer just wasn't a very sunny guy and leave it at that. The next generation of philosophers who looked at Schopenhauer's philosophy thought to themselves, well, that can't be right. Life just can't be an unending period of suffering. But what does give our life meaning? The philosopher who probably more than any other created modern society in the age of the book is Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche is often remembered for saying God is dead. And this is often told to us as if he was being happy, that he was happy God was dead. We've been liberated from God. This is all great. That's not what Friedrich Nietzsche was saying. What he was saying, okay, sure, God is dead, but we're his murderers. What do we do now? And indeed, the entire quote from Friedrich Nietzsche is shown here. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? In other words, our modern society has lost what gave our ancestors meaning in the age of the church. We've questioned church doctrine. We've questioned everything. We have, in essence, and he was saying this in the 1800s, 1875, a period that many of us would look back on as being an intensely religious age, and I suppose compared to our age it was. But it wasn't as intensely religious as it had been 100 years before that. And Friedrich Nietzsche looked around and said, look, we have destroyed the thing that gave our lives meaning. What do we do now? How do we make up for this? Where do we find meaning in our lives? This is a crisis not only of faith, but a crisis of individual human meaning that came about directly because of the invention and existence of printed books. We didn't just get rid of the church. We got rid of the thing that gave the lives of common people meaning. And by 1875, well, we didn't really know what to do about that. Now, the other thing that happened during this period was that the elites changed. Obviously, the church was in charge in the age of the church, but as we've noted, the church elites lost all of their real temporal power. There were new elites that were created in the age of the book. So academia, the people who ran the printing presses, ultimately the creation of news media, politicians. We've already seen how in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, certainly in those countries that had state churches, the church was explicitly subordinate to the will of the ruler, who was the head of the church. He was the chief political and religious authority. So these new elites rose. If you would have gone back to 1451 or 1452 or any time before his death in 1455, and you'd have asked Pope Nicholas V, hey, what do you think about this book thing? How do you think that's going to work out for you? He would have had no idea that when he received his copy of the Bible from Gutenberg, which he thought was very beautiful, he had no idea that he was holding in his hands the seed of destruction of all of the power that he and his papal predecessors had held over all of Western Europe. He just thought it was a really pretty Bible, and he liked it a bunch. Well, in the age of the book, the rise of new elites led to the rise of new gatekeepers. Now, this is a cultural change that obviously happens over time. It happens in fits and starts. But just as in the age of the church, in 450 AD, the church didn't have monolithic control over all of Europe. That didn't come around for another 300 or 400 years. But ultimately, it did come around. And so similarly in the age of the book, these new elites who become informational gatekeepers didn't come around eventually, but they're certainly informational gatekeepers now. Ultimately, academia decided what was science and what wasn't science, what could be published and what couldn't be published. Before the 20th century, if you had some cool scientific idea, you could probably get it published in a scientific journal. There were a bunch of them that were published periodically. So throughout the 1800s, Albert Einstein was not a scientist in the early part of the 20th century. He was a clerk in a patent office when he wrote his initial papers on general and special relativity. He was not a teacher. He did not have a position at a university. He was a government patent office clerk. And yet, he was able to publish a paper that fundamentally changed physics forever. Pretty much anybody could publish in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. However, we came up with this idea called peer review, especially after World War II, which meant that the scientific publishers, the publishers of scientific journals, they could decide what got published along with the selected peer reviewers that they chose. And so now you can't really publish a scientific paper unless the gatekeepers allow you to publish it. So academia is now a gatekeeper for science. If you wanted to publish a book in the 20th century, it was always possible to self-publish. If you had enough money and you had some 100-page book of poetry that you wanted to publish and have people see, you could do it. And it would cost you some money, and you could probably get 100 copies of it published. But would it be sold in a bookstore? No. No, because no one would have seen it. No one but you could disseminate it. There was no marketing. There was no publishing. If you wanted a book published, you had to get it past a publisher. And publishers would look over your manuscript and decide if what you had written in your book was, in their view, worth publishing or not. And if they had decided not, then your book just never got published. And indeed, by the 20th century, we had a news media that decided you would hear what they wanted you to hear. When I was a kid, everybody watched Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News. And in a half-hour news program, when you take out commercials, Walter Cronkite had 22 minutes to tell you what was going on in the world. And indeed, at the end of every broadcast, Walter Cronkite assured you that he had told you everything that was going on in the world by saying, "And that's the way it is." But what in that 22 minutes was Walter Cronkite not telling us? Of course, now we know that there's lots of things that the news media was never telling us. For example, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, he'd had polio. He was crippled. He couldn't walk. He had to use a wheelchair. And the news media never mentioned it. They never published pictures of him in a wheelchair because, having a president in a wheelchair makes him look weak. Whatever it was, the American people were never told that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was crippled by polio. And they ensured that any pictures of Roosevelt, for example, when he was speaking or what have you, he was either sitting in his car or he was standing at a podium. And by standing, I mean he had crutches that he rested his entire body weight with his arms so that he could stand upright. And he learned how to briefly pick himself up and for short distances walk with the use of these canes on his arms. But that was all hidden from us. By the way, when Jack Kennedy was president, everybody knew in the press corps that Jack Kennedy was having sex with lots of girls. Nobody said anything about it. The important thing about Walter Cronkite and his 22 minutes turns out not to have been what he was telling us, as valuable as it might have been, but what he wasn't telling us in those 22 minutes. These were all gatekeepers who were deciding what information we could get. Now, their ability to gatekeep was vastly less than the churches had been in the age of the church, because they didn't really have full control over all aspects of information the way that the church could exercise it prior to 1450. So there were plenty of weird ideas in the age of the book that we had to come up with. For example, this desperate search for meaning led many people to publish religious ideas about how the end of the world was coming, what William F. Buckley once called the imminentization of the eschaton, which means the end of the world is coming very soon. For example, somebody could publish a book and say, hey, you know what? Jesus is coming back, and he's coming back to Poughkeepsie, New York on June 5th, 1855, and we all have to travel to Poughkeepsie, New York to go to this random hill in Poughkeepsie so that we can watch as Jesus comes back. Hundreds, even thousands of people would turn up to these things. And it's not something that happened once. It happened, especially in the United States, it happened fairly frequently. Because again, even though there were gatekeepers, the gatekeeping system wasn't perfect. People could get weird ideas through, including, some relatively unorthodox religious ideas. They got through. Science wasn't a perfect gatekeeper because there were other ideas that got through science. I mean, there was a point in the 1800s when scientists thought that you could tell a lot about a person by their skull measurements. That, you could measure someone's skull using something called phrenology, and you could tell whether they were, going to be a criminal, for example, or whether they were smarter or dumber than most people. One of the dumbest ideas of all, an explicitly utopian idea, Marxism, became extremely popular. Marxism, which claimed a scientific basis for the class struggle and had a predictive hypothesis about where human culture would end, it was all pseudoscience. It was all made up by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They believed it, and it certainly got published and had, ultimately very awful consequences for many people, especially in Eastern Europe and in Asia. But that was a legitimate weird idea that got out. Also, the idea of racial superiority. There were a whole bunch of books that talked about the different races and what they were good at and what they were bad at, all of which was just simple pseudoscience. And this is in an age when, we were actually had pretty much figured out the scientific method. And yet these weird ideas got through. So despite the fact that there were gatekeepers, there were still plenty of weird ideas in the book age. And it was relatively easy for those ideas to get disseminated, some of which had some pretty nasty effects on society as a whole. The book age reached its apex in June of 1969 when Neil Armstrong stepped down off of the ladder of the lunar module and placed his feet on the surface of the moon. It's perhaps the most important scientific and cultural achievement in human history. A human being has stood on another planet. And we didn't just do it once. We sent people back 5 more times up to 1973. That's not exactly true. We actually sent people back 6 more times. But unfortunately, one of them was unable to land. So actually, it was Apollo. So no, we sent 7 missions to the moon as a whole. Apollo 13 only orbited the moon because they had a problem and they came back. So it says 5 times. It's actually, we went back 6 more times. 7 times. 14 men have stood on the surface of the moon. And we've never been back. If you'd have told me in 1969, and I distinctly remember this, in 1969, sitting in our living room, watching the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket launch from Cape Canaveral, or Cape Kennedy at the time. We were watching it on a little 13-inch black and white television. And if you'd have told me that 60 years later, I am 58, so it would have been 52 years later. If you'd have told me 52 years later, 53 years later actually, that no one would have ever gone back to the surface of the moon after Apollo 17, I would have thought you were a nut. And yet we didn't. We decided that there was nothing worth our time by going back to the moon. Further space exploration, largely anything outside of low Earth orbit on a manned basis, was pointless. Decline is a choice. And in 1973, we made that choice. And as a result, we haven't really done anything of that nature, of that size, that required that much commitment since 1973. But it's even, I think, a little worse than that. Eric Weinstein, who basically works for Thiel Global Capital, said a couple of years ago, and I think it's a very interesting thing to think about. He said, go into your living room. Just look around your living room, and in your mind, subtract anything with a screen. So your phone, computers, laptops, tablets, whatever. Largely, even your TV, really. Subtract anything with a screen. And now look around your living room, and what do you see in your living room that tells you you're not living in 1973? I've done that myself. And, if I get rid of my MacBook and my iPad and my iPhone and my big Samsung Smart TV, and I look around that room, I don't see anything that I would not have seen in 1973. There's literally nothing in my living room that if I was just transported here magically from 1973 and the screened stuff was gone, there's nothing that would have frightened or confused me. We've reached our apex, and societally, we've kind of drawn back. You hear we don't do big things anymore, which kind of is true. Think about after 9/11 when the Twin Towers fell. It took 17 years, I believe, 16 years, to rebuild a building in Manhattan to replace the World Trade Centers. In the 1930s, we built the Empire State Building in 6 months, but after 9/11, it took 16 years to rebuild the World Trade Centers. It's very difficult for us to do big things anymore. But now, and this is where the explanation begins to come in. I've told this long historical story to get us to here. We have reached the end of the book age. Indeed, the book age was killed not too long ago. There were some precursor technologies that we needed to kill the age of the book. During the 1950s and 60s, we had digital computing and the advances in digital computing that would lead us to individual computers that could be owned by, at the time, basically large businesses. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, it was the work on the communications protocol. It's called TCP/IP, that allows computers to talk to each other. And once those computers could talk to each other, we could network those computers together so that they could talk together inside a network, usually inside a single building. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, the cost had to come down. There had to be a ubiquity of computers so that not just a business of a sufficient size could own a computer, but you could own a computer in your home. When I was 16 years old in 1980, my dad brought home a TRS-80 Model 1 personal computer. It had 24 kilobytes of memory, and it had a cassette tape drive, which was basically a Radio Shack cassette player that when you put a programming tape in, a little cassette tape, and you hit play, it would read that tape through signals, electronic signals, into the computer's memory. So you could put this tape in, hit play, wait for about 15 minutes, and then you could play a Star Trek game on this TRS-80 Model 1. Now, it was very expensive relatively at the time, but clearly cheap enough for my dad, who was not wealthy, to be able to bring home a TRS-80 Model 1 and to begin having a home computer. And by the 1990s, computers were accessible to almost everyone. What that resulted in the middle to the end of the 1990s and in the early 2000s, was the ability to take all of these separate networks that had been created in all of these different geographical locations and to hook them all together into a network of networks that we call the Internet. And the Internet ended the book age. We're now living in a new age called the age of information. There are two primary results of the age of information. Number one, while the creation of books increased by an order of magnitude the amount of information that was accessible to normal people, the information age has now increased that again by yet another order of magnitude. So almost all of the information that has been presented or created or collated in human history, nearly all human knowledge, is now available to you on your phone. You can go out on the internet and you can find out about just about anything. It is a massive increase in the access that we have to information, but it added something new. It democratized the production of information and the ability to go past gatekeepers. For example, you want to publish a book. Do you have to go to a publisher? No. You can print your book out. Well, you don't have to print your book out. You can save your book as a Word document. And you can take that Word document and upload it to Amazon, and Amazon will publish your book on Kindle. Indeed, Amazon will also give you an option for on-demand printing of your book in case somebody wants a hard copy of it, not just an electronic copy of it. Who stands between you and Amazon? No one. There is no publisher. There's no one to whom you have to go for approval. You can just publish your books. There's a guy named Christopher G. Nuttall. He's a British guy. He has published every book that he has published via Amazon. He does not have a normal publisher. He probably at this point has 50 or 60 books he's published. The guy writes like a book a week. I don't understand how he does it. I've written 2 books and it was like pulling teeth to get those 2 published. He manages to knock out a brand new full-size novel every week, and he publishes them on Kindle, and he has sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies all by himself. He is his own publisher. Another friend of mine, Robert Crozy, a guy who I have known about and who I've, at least in recent years, had contact with and spoken with, or corresponded with. Robert Crozy took a humorous website that he had and has parlayed it into his own sort of publishing empire as well. So that's one gatekeeper gone. What you're looking at right now is another gatekeeper gone. I'm doing a live broadcast on YouTube from a television studio I've built in my office. I have the ability to create television broadcasts that back in the 1980s or 1990s, I might have been able to create the video for it. It would have cost me, thousands of dollars, but I probably could have done it. But how would I have ever gotten it to you? Today, I can live stream on YouTube, clearly not super competently, but it can be done. And I can do what I'm doing now. Espouse a world historical theory about cultural change that I wouldn't have been able to do in the age of the book. I mean, I would have had to get this broadcast. I would have had to go through a network or a television or cable channel and convince enough people that I had a good idea and that somebody might want to watch it. I still don't know if anybody wants to watch it, but I have the power, the capability to actually produce it and not have to worry about gatekeepers anymore. Heck, I could just build my own website and I could write my ideas down and put them out on the internet, and they're publicly available to anybody. Now, there's millions of web pages. How they would know where that web page was would probably require some effort on my part to get someone to pay attention to it. But all of this is nearly free. I'm not paying for, the time that it is taking me to talk here on YouTube. It's just happening, and it happens for free. And the most important thing is that this is not just like the age of the church was, a regional age that was largely segregated to Western Europe and ultimately expanded to North and South America. This is a global change of age. The church age was largely Western Europe. The book age became largely global, and now we live in a global environment. And so the death of the book age is also a global cultural change. By the way, that's one of the things that the book age did that I didn't mention, although I probably should have, which is the dissemination of culture worldwide. In the year 330, we wouldn't have known, and indeed did not know, what someone in China or Vietnam or South America or Japan thought about, anything. We wouldn't have any way of getting that information across to them. But of course, in the book age, books go all over the world. They're translated into many different languages, and beyond books, movies, television shows, those are all part of the book age, part of the media that was created in the book age. It has globalized our culture. Indeed, popular culture, some would argue, both approvingly and disapprovingly, global popular culture is largely American global popular culture because of the influence of our media on the world. So this change that we are seeing from the age of book to the age of information is a global change, not a regional change, and it's affecting the entire world, which is why so many global elites in many different countries seem to be on the same page. But here's what happens whenever you change an age. First of all, you have an existing elite, which we currently do. We know who they are, the political and media and financial elites. And they're going to lose that gatekeeper status. We can see it happening in publishing and broadcasting and many other areas. Now what do? It doesn't matter if people in the media decide they're not going to report on something. I mean, it certainly matters at the margin because there are still people, because remember, we are just at the very beginning of the age of information. And most of us have grown up in the age of the book. And many of us still have cultural attitudes that were built in the age of the book. So if the media decides not to cover something, there are a lot of people who still trust the media, who still trust that they are being told what is going on. And I think those people are a little behind times, but the media can prevent some information from getting to those people. But largely that doesn't matter because there are other alternative means of reportage. There has been the rise of citizen journalists who, when something happens, they can just go out, take their phone, take video, and just show it on Twitter, show it live, indeed, on Twitter, or on Instagram, or whatever other social media that they happen to have. We can actually have people go and do on-the-ground reporting, just normal civilians. And of course, once this information is available, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram or wherever, it's now publicly accessible. Anybody who sees it can now talk about it and can expand it, can amplify its reach. We don't need to depend on reporting. The example that comes to my mind is COVID-19 and the COVID-19 vaccinations. So the government told us that these COVID vaccinations would, and they told us this explicitly, that these vaccines would stop transmission. Now, we're not going to get into the whole thing. We'll just confine it to the idea of, did the vaccine stop transmission? That was the reporting that we got. The news media parroted that. Hey, this will stop transmission. The government parroted it. Indeed, to the point that the government was trying to impose vaccine mandates on the entire country, saying that if you don't get vaccinated, you are a danger to everyone around you because you can transmit the vaccine. But if you get vaccinated, you won't be able to transmit it. Therefore, we can force you to do it because everyone else's safety requires it. But of course, that wasn't true. The vaccines were never tested for stopping transmission. And to the extent that studies were done on the vaccines after their release, it's shown that they don't actually stop transmission. Now, we were blatantly lied to by a government who knew that there was no testing, no evidence whatsoever that the vaccine stopped transmission. And yet they told us that, and indeed tried to force these vaccines on everyone using that lie. If this had been 1970, we probably would never know that that was a lie. But because information is so easily accessible and so easily available, and once accessed can be so easily amplified by regular people, we now know that in that specific case, the government is lying. I could probably go through a whole bunch of other cases where the government is lying, but I think this one example suffices. So we don't need these reporting gatekeepers. This information is going to get out all on its own. Now, of course, our current elites, just like the church elites in the 14 and 1500s who were selling indulgences so that you could be instantly cleansed of all sin by paying them, of course, an appropriate amount of gold. Well, we have similarly corrupt elites today. So when the New York Post comes out and says, hey, this laptop that somebody found at this computer store, it looks like Hunter Biden's laptop, and there's some sketchy stuff on that thing. 50 former intelligence leaders and CIA directors and NSA chairmen and all of that all come out and say, no, this looks like Russian disinformation. They knew it wasn't Russian disinformation. But the Biden campaign got them all to sign on to it so that it would help Biden get elected. We don't want anybody to think Joe Biden is corrupt. Too late. But it's this collusion with not only these guys, but then, of course, look at what Facebook and what Twitter did. These CIA guys say that this is a bunch of BS, so we are just going to ban that story from being talked about on our social media platforms. And, of course, whenever they did that, the story became these social media platforms have now banned this story. In 1970, if that story had been banned and nobody had reported it, you never would have been able to get word out. Instead, in 2020, banning that story itself became a story. Hey, social media is banning this story from the New York Post. Why don't we all go read the story in the New York Post? They're losing their power to gatekeep, but they are so corrupt and so interested in rent seeking, which is an economic term, which means I am looking for money that people should not, there's no economic justification for taking this money or power, but I have the ability to take it, so I'm going to take it anyway. It's called rent seeking, and that's what they're doing. They're trying to do all the rent seeking they can. And in the age of the book, they could get away with it. We didn't know that they were engaged in this kind of rent seeking because they were gatekeepers. They could hide information from us. But we're learning now that they can't hide that information, certainly not effectively anymore. Sure, you can sometimes hide it from some people. They'll never see it. And those people you can keep in your pocket, but like Abraham Lincoln said, you can't fool all of the people all of the time. That information now gets out, and these book elites hate it because they like their elite status. They like being able to rent seek. They like the money and power that comes with that status. And the corruption, by the way, that it engenders among them. They love all of it, and they're not willingly going to let that power go away. They're not just going to walk away any more than the popes and high churchmen allowed their power to be diminished in the 15th and 16th century. In fact, the Pope wanted to maintain his power so strongly that he was willing to kill 8 million people in Germany in the 30 Years' War just to ensure that things didn't change. And what happened was he killed 8 million people and things changed anyway. Our elites are not going to go quietly, but they are in a box. The book elites, just like Pope Anthony V, they thought the internet was a great thing, and initially it was, because it did allow them to increase their power and their reach, and they allowed it to get into every aspect of society. So really every aspect of trade, of our economy, of global supply chains, even our currencies, the flow of information, everything is now based on the internet, because the elites saw ways in which the internet could increase their financial power in the old book system, but they didn't see until too late that the internet now threatens their elite status. They saw the short-term benefits of embracing the internet and asking all of us to embrace it. What they didn't see were the long-term disruptions that were going to come from it and threaten the very bases of their power as the book elites. As we've talked about, first long-term disruption, bypassing informational gatekeepers. It's impossible now to effectively restrict the flow of information on the internet. Second of all, new ages, new technologies like the internet means that there are going to be new elites. Because the people like in publishing companies who could control what books were published, they can't do that anymore. How do they maintain their elite status when no one needs their service? Now, there will be services that people need in the information age. That is going to cause the rise of information elites. And these information elites will largely not be the same people who were the book elites. The book elites are gone. They don't know it yet, and we don't exactly know how long a time it is going to take to eliminate the book elites, but they are going to be eliminated and replaced by the information elites. Information is going to move more freely as it becomes substantially cheaper. It continues to get substantially cheaper over time to transmit information, to store information and access it. That shows no signs of slowing. Indeed, we may be on the verge with quantum computing of massively cheapening while at the same time increasing our capacity to store and process information. And with this more freedom of information, there's going to be more heterodox thought. More people are going to have newer, more different ideas, and it's going to be impossible to stop those ideas from being propagated in the age of information. So on the one hand, it looks, okay, great. All these things you just talked about are good things, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be an unalloyed good any more than the creation of the book age was an unalloyed good. There are some things that we need to be cautious about. This is unpredictable. We don't know what the results are. Again, if you'd asked the Pope in 1500, how do you think this book thing is all going to turn out? He wouldn't have known. He wouldn't have been able to answer your question, and the answers, well, not with any accuracy, and the answers he gave would have been wildly inaccurate. But we do know that in their determination not to lose their elite status, we do know what the church was willing to do and how many people they were willing to kill to maintain their elite status throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. And indeed, on up into the 18th and in a couple of cases, even the 19th century in France. We don't know who the new information elites are going to be. Now, right now, when we think of information elites, we think of Google and Amazon. And sure, they're elites now, but are they elites because they have some permanent advantage, or are they just, in the short term, receiving the advantages of being early movers in the information age? Will we need their services going forward as the full effects of switching over to the information age applies? We have no way of knowing. I suspect that the information elites of 20 years from now will not be the information elites that have risen over the past 20 years. How will this affect our culture? The death of the age of the church from 1450 to 1875, so a period of 425 years, led to a fundamental elimination of the one cultural axiom that everyone shared that gave meaning to people's lives. What will the ultimate cultural result be of the end of the book era and the new ideas and thoughts and changes that are going to come out in the era of information? Well, the answer to all these questions is we don't know, because we are not able to predict, much less control, what the possible outcomes might be. If we can't predict it, we certainly can't control it. And it is by its very nature unpredictable. I can draw a straight line from Johannes Gutenberg printing the Bible in 1450 to Louis XVI having his head chopped off in 1791. There's a straight line linkage of those events. But could I have predicted the French Revolution in 1450 or 1500? No, of course not. And being unable to predict it, there's certainly no way that I could have stopped it. We're living in what I'm calling the frothy time. You have to remember, the information age really is only 25 years old. Yeah, there was the internet and people had some access. Some people accessed the internet back in the 1990s. But it's really post 9/11, sometime after about 2001, that the internet really and truly exploded as a publicly accessible and publicly used appliance or commodity. And really, you might even extend that data out a little further. You might extend it out to the creation of the smartphone in 2007 with the first iPhone, which was followed very quickly by the very first Android phones. And you might make the argument that it really wasn't until 2007 and 2008 with the advent of smartphones that we really began to use the internet, and it became a ubiquitous part of our life. But even if we use the most charitable definition of when the information age would have started, I think it probably takes us back to 1997, 1998. At most, the information age is 25 years old. We're not seeing the results of a switch from the book age to the information age. We're in the middle of the initial disruptions, the initial dislocations that are being prompted by a change in ages, transforming from the book age to the information age. We are just in the middle of the very first and very initial disruptions that we are going to see. This is the beginning of change. It's not the end of change. I don't know when the end of change will be, but I do know that we can expect both good change and probably bad change. And we also know, without knowing what that change might be, especially for the bad stuff, we don't really know how to fix it or prevent it or otherwise ameliorate what might happen. So right now, the frothy time is a time of disruption, and it's a time of uncertainty. It's a time of constant change. And as I said, because we're just getting started, the weirdness that we're seeing now, this is just the beginning. We should expect more weirdness coming up, not less weirdness. Things aren't going to get more sane anytime soon because we are just on the cusp of change. It's going to take a while to begin settling out what this means to our society. So the problem is, what do we do about it? Well, I don't know. No one does. No one can answer that question because we're in the middle of a civilizational upheaval. And the effects of that upheaval on both our politics and our culture and our institutions and our elites are not something that we can know or really predict. The best we can do, and apparently I wrote the nest we can do, the best we can do is arm ourselves with the knowledge that we live in a time of fundamental change. That we were lucky enough to live at the end of the book age, which, by the way, was in many ways a golden era of human civilization. We thought we understood the world. We thought we understood our institutions. We thought our institutions were relatively trustworthy. We had some pretty good lives in the 1980s and 1990s. And, well, really from the end of World War II, the 1950s through the 1990s. Sure, there were some bad times here and there, but for the most part, we were always able to recover. We lived in a golden age of human civilization, and we are now entering an age of uncertainty. We can't go back to the way things were because now we know what was wrong. We now know what we didn't know back then. We now know that there was much that was hidden from us and that had we known at the time, we might have made different decisions about our politics and our culture. We can't go back. The only path forward, well, is forward and seeing what is coming down the pike at us as it comes at us. All we can know is that this change is coming. So, welcome to the age of information. That's the age we live in now. And basically, we're going to have to figure all this shit out as we go. And that's probably the best we can do. Well, thanks for listening to this publication. Again, I'm sorry for the first 15 minutes or so. The OBS wasn't keeping up with what was going on in the presentation, so I apologize for that. And so it's just me talking with nothing much happening in the background. At least I was able to fix that eventually. And what I am going to fix now is trying to find a way out of this podcast with some background music, which, you know, it's always hard whenever I'm on here solo. You know, when Michael is on, I can spend the time while he's talking to find music and all the other things that I have to do. Unfortunately, when I'm talking, I can't do that. I have to do everything live. And as you can see, me doing everything live sometimes doesn't turn out as perfectly as it might otherwise. In any event, that's it for this podcast. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for listening. We'll look forward to seeing you again next time when hopefully Michael will once again be here. Until then, have a great week. So long.